It is December 5th, 2024. On this day in baseball history, a lot of things happened.
You are Locked On MLB, your daily MLB podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, baseball fans. Welcome to Locked On MLB, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. This is the daily podcast. We talk about all of Major League Baseball. I am your host, Paul Francis Sullivan. Please call me Sully. I've been a baseball podcaster for quite a while now, and pretty soon I'll be starting my 7th season here as a host of the Locked On Podcast Network. Follow us at Locked On MLB Pods on Twitter or whatever it's called now, and on Instagram. I'm your pal Sully. I'm at Sully Baseball at Blue Sky, Sully Baseball Podcast on Instagram. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. It is December 5th, and you know what? Usually on December 5th, it's a day that it is December 5th, and usually this day in baseball history in December is kind of light because the season's over. And so there's not a lot of baseball going on. And sometimes a big trade is made here or there, but usually the news is a little bit light in December. And if you don't believe me, I'm doing a baseball podcast in December, and I sometimes have a hard time coming up with whatever content we're going to do. Don't worry, I always come up with something. But for some reason, when I looked up this day in baseball history, December 5th was quite plentiful. And let's go through some of the big events that happened over the years this December 5th. Yeah, I mentioned yesterday about the Federal League and some of the other things that happened on December 4th, but December 5th was pretty crowded. Now, in 1958, remember that was a significant year in baseball history because the Yankees had the city of New York all to themselves. To the absolute amazement of baseball, the Giants moved to San Francisco and the Dodgers moved here to Los Angeles. And the National League fans in New York feel like they had the rug pulled from out underneath them. And the National League wanted to make some inroads into New York. And there were a lot of rumors that maybe the fledgling Cincinnati Reds would become the New York Reds. How about that as a weird what if? Well, the Phillies were just right down the Jersey Turnpike from the city of New York, and they wanted to buy broadcast rights to New York and to try to siphon off the bittered Giants fans and Dodger fans who didn't have a National League team. The Phillies saw cha-ching. Not only did the Philadelphia Phillies get the entire Philadelphia market to themselves when the A's decided to ski-daddle to Kansas City, they felt like, wait a minute, could we dive deep into New York as well? Could we get all of New Jersey? Could we get all of those bitter Giant and Dodger fans who refuse to become Yankee fans? And suddenly there was a big potential lawsuit, and the Yankees found an interesting way to counter program the Phillies tapping in to New York, and that was the Yankees wanted to broadcast in Philadelphia. The Phillies were not that great, and the Yankees won the pennant again and would go on to win they won the 1958 World Series. And they said, "Oh, you want to dip into our market? We'll dip into yours." And the Phillies realized, you know what? Maybe it's best that we try not to compete with the Yankees. Also on this date, in 1973, the Los Angeles Dodgers made a memorable move with the Montreal Expos. Willie Davis, who had been a fixture in Los Angeles for many years, was sent packing to the Montreal Expos. The person they got back for him was Mike Marshall, who eventually became Dr. Mike Marshall. Mike Marshall was the man who figured out how to pitch and not blow your arm out. I don't know how he did it, but he did. In 1971, 72, and 73, he made durability out of the bullpen a pretty remarkable thing. He wound up throwing 179 innings in 1973 for the Montreal Expos. He won 14 games, and he wound up having a good ERA of 2.66. The thing that makes that interesting is that was 179 innings. Say it with me, everyone. Out of the bullpen. He was a relief pitcher and gave Montreal 179 innings out of the pen. The previous year, he gave 116 innings out of the pen, all in relief, and wound up pitching to a 1.78 ERA. This was someone who figured out how to pitch basically every day, or as close to every day as you can, and did so without blowing out his arm, at least not during that stretch. When he came to Los Angeles in 1974, he wound up pitching 208 innings. Let that sink in for a second. He threw 208 innings of relief. He wound up winning 15 games, saving 21 games. He finished 83 ball games. And the thing that I find interesting is he struck out 143 batters, but it wasn't like he was striking out a batter an inning. He just got through it. Now, granted, by the time he got to 1977, his arm was pretty much gone, although he came back and threw 142 and two-thirds innings of relief in 1979 when he played for the Minnesota Twins. But I've always wondered, because, he kept talking about how he figured out how to throw without busting your arm open, and eventually became a doctor and was able to come up with scientific reasons and scientific methods to pitch and not blow your proverbial arm out. And I don't understand why people don't study that. I think one part of it may have been that he wasn't trying to strike out every batter. And I've mentioned that before, that hitters are allowed to strike out and pitchers are just trying to strike out, and we're discounting any balls into play, even if it means that may get you through an inning faster. Either way, it's safe to say it was a trade that worked out pretty well for the Dodgers, as Mike Marshall went on to win the Cy Young Award as he pitched in 106 ball games, finishing 83 in 1974. When it comes down to a player who changed their spot and moved to a different ball club, on this day in 1978, a seismic free agent signing happened that was one of those kind of moves that you didn't even think was possible before free agency. Hey, let's hear from our friends over at Game Time. Hey, I've used Game Time before. They came through for me big time when I went to see the National League Championship Series. I saw the Dodgers clinch against the Mets in Game 6. Got a great deal and great seats through Game Time. And now Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Game Time Picks that gives you curation to make it easy to save more on sports, concert, comedy, theater, and more. You get seat views, a panoramic view of your seat in the app before you buy, the lowest price guarantee, or Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. And you got the Game Time ticket coverage. Your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, Use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It's game time. On this day in 1978, and this is actually one of the early memories I had as a baseball fan, Pete Rose became a millionaire. Now, he signed a 4-year, $3.2 million contract. These days, that's what you give a middle infielder coming off the bench. But in 1978, on this day, that was a massive contract. And the idea that players could become millionaires was a pretty new phenomenon. And the idea that a player could say, hey, here's a team that I've been with and been associated with my whole dang career. I'm going to go somewhere else, which is exactly what happened when Pete Rose left the Cincinnati Reds. Pete Rose was the Cincinnati Reds. Now, you could point out that maybe you could say that Johnny Bench was the bigger star or Joe Morgan was the one winning the MVPs and everything like that. But Pete Rose, the World Series MVP in 1975, the National League MVP in what year did he win the National League MVP? He won the MVP in 1973. Was the spark plug of the Big Red Machine. And after playing with them from 1963 until 1978, 15 years of playing for the Cincinnati Reds. And of course, where was he born? Cincinnati. Where did he go to high school? Western Hills High School in Cincinnati. He was everything that you look at as, well, obviously he's a Red for life. And then he tested the free agent waters and he signed with Philadelphia. And Philadelphia, you have to understand, I mentioned them earlier. The Phillies were a team that had never won the World Series, ever. And they were a team that was tantalizingly close in 77 and 78. They made the playoffs in 76, but Pete Rose, the Big Red Machine, clobbered them. It was a walk-off win in the final, but it was a clean sweep. They lost a tough league championship series to Los Angeles in both 77 and 78. And there was something about the team that they looked like, well, they're good enough to make the playoffs, but not good enough to get over the hump. They don't have that fire. They don't have that this. They don't have that. Now, at the time, Pete Rose was a third baseman for the Cincinnati Reds. And the Philadelphia Phillies had a third baseman. Maybe you've heard of him. His name was Michael Jack Schmidt. And the Phillies had Rickey Henderson, who was a good player at first base, and they had kind of a rotating. Sometimes you would see you would see Jose Cardinal playing first base. Sometimes you saw what's his name? Jay Johnstone played a little bit of first base. But Pete Rose, who came up as a second baseman, played the outfield, played third base. The Phillies said, come play first for us. Come play first. Move across the diamond and play alongside Mike Schmidt, which is exactly what happened. Now, Rose had a solid first year in Philadelphia. He led the league in on-base percentage. He batted .331. He stole 20 bases, but the Phillies didn't have a great season. They were finished in fourth place behind the Pirates. But in 1980, the Phillies won just their third pennant in their history in, I'll say it, the greatest postseason series ever played in baseball history, which was the 1980 National League Championship Series against the Houston Astros. And then Pete Rose was part of the team that finally won the World Series for the Phillies. And it almost didn't happen because at one point it looked like the front runner to get Pete Rose's services was not the Philadelphia Phillies, but was actually going to be the Pittsburgh Pirates. And if he had joined the Pirates in 1979, he would have been the third baseman. Willie Stargell would have stayed at first, and Dave Parker, who was unbelievable that his whole career in Pittsburgh, you would have had that team. Now, would they have won the World Series? Well, obviously, you think you're adding Pete Rose to a star-studded team, they're going to do well. But if there ever was a team who seemed to be perfectly constructed based on their team chemistry, it was the 1979 Pittsburgh Pirates. Now, whose biggest star was Dave Parker. He was the superstar of the team. The biggest leader on that team was Willie Stargell, who, even the sabermetric crowd will point out that he was 9th in WAR on his own team and won the MVP in a tie with Keith Hernandez. Nope, you don't get it. Stargell was the leader of that team, got huge hit after huge hit, was a force to be reckoned with in the playoffs and in the World Series, where he won the MVP of the World Series and got the huge home run in Game 7. Anything that would have changed the chemistry even a tiny bit that year would have seemed, I don't know, could have tipped the whole thing off. And then Pirate fans would be saying they haven't won the World Series since 1971. And if Pete Rose did not come to the Philadelphia Phillies, then maybe the Phillies don't win a World Series until 2008. Either way, this day in 1978, Pete Rose left the Reds. On this day in 1984, a superstar like Pete Rose, who played with intensity like Pete Rose, and like Pete Rose, played for the team in the city that he grew up in. That would be Rickey Henderson. On this day, the same day that, in 1978, Pete Rose left the Reds, on this day, Rickey Henderson left Oakland. Now, this was not a free agent situation, but this was a situation where the A's were not a big contender. This was a situation where the A's were, in 1984, the A's were a losing team. They didn't know where they were going. Now, granted, they were playing in a very winnable division, but they knew that Rickey Henderson eventually would be facing free agency, and off he was shipped to the New York Yankees. Now, the interesting thing about this trade for me is that the A's traded Henderson to the Yankees, where he was going to be alongside Dave Winfield, Don Mattingly. It was a star-studded team. And the A's got back a bunch of players: Jay Howell, Jose Rio, Stan Javier, Eric Plunk. And each one of those players played a big part in the rebuilding of the A's into a championship team. Now, Howell was the closer until he got hurt and was replaced by Eckersley. And so when Eckersley took over, Howell became a key trade chip to bring Bob Welch over. Jose Rio pitched well, became a key trade chip to acquire Dave Parker. Stan Javier gave them some outfield depth that they really needed. And Eric Plunk was a solid reliever who later was used to reacquire Rickey Henderson. And while Jay Howell wound up saving a game against the A's in the World Series in 1988 as a member of the Dodgers, and Jose Rio was the World Series MVP against the A's in 1990, Rickey Henderson, coming back triumphantly in 1989 after a bunch of years where he couldn't make the playoffs with the Yankees. It was a strange situation that trading Rickey gave them chips to build a championship team, and one of those chips allowed to bring Rickey Henderson back. So it was a strange situation, kind of like LeBron going to Miami only to come back and bring a championship to Cleveland. When Rickey Henderson returned to Oakland, he was the final piece in that championship puzzle, and one that paid off big time when he was the MVP of the League Championship Series in 1989. We come back. There are two other things that happened on this day. One was the kind of trade I wish we saw more of, and the other is the kind of agreement baseball needs to keep doing. All right, let's hear from our friends over at FanDuel. You know what FanDuel is. It's America's #1 sportsbook, and get ready to tackle NFL action with FanDuel. What's going to happen this season? Are the Chiefs going to win it again? Or one of the four mediocre teams in the NFC West? Which one is going to get to the playoffs, or will one of them run the table and get all the way to the Super Bowl? I don't know, but if you know, maybe you should go to FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get bet $5 and get 150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So if you get a hunch in the middle of the game, I think the Seahawks are going to do it. You can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page when you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and never waste a moment more with FanDuel, an official sports partner of the NFL. On this day in 1990, I remember I was living in New York City, and they used to have this daily paper called The National, which was basically just a sports section. Now, people with the internet, who grew up only with the internet, will never understand why getting the scores on the newspaper was so important. But it was, because that's how you got the scores. That's how you read what happened the night before. And living on the East Coast, it was frustrating because the West Coast games always ended too late. But for whatever reason, the National was able to get them. So I'd grab the National and pick it up and read what the West Coast scores were. And of course, this was December of 1990, but I picked it up anyway on this date, and I saw there was a wild trade. The Blue Jays sent Fred McGriff and Tony Fernandez to San Diego for Roberto Alomar and Joe Carter. This is a trade that involved two future Hall of Famers, and neither one was exactly at a bad part of their career. Roberto Alomar was a rising star. Fred McGriff watched those Tom Amansky videos and was still one of the premier sluggers in the game. And then Fernandez and Joe Carter were no slouches either. This was a shakeup of the Toronto Blue Jays, who, like I mentioned, the Phillies before, were always close, but not close enough. And they were filled with the greatest homegrown outfield I'd ever seen of George Bell, Lloyd Mosby, and Jesse Barfield, and tons of players like McGriff, like Damasio Garcia, like Tony Fernandez, like Kelly Gruber, but they weren't, there was always a team in their way, whether it was the Royals in 85 or the Red Sox in 86, Detroit in 87, the Red Sox again in 88, and the A's in 89, and the Red Sox again in 1990. They always looked like they had the most talented team, and some other team got in their way. And this was a trade that kind of shook up the identity of the team. Fernandez and McGriff looked like players who were going to be Blue Jays for life. Actually, Fred McGriff was a farmhand in the Yankees organization, but was one of the many stars who the Yankees traded away in order to get superstars in the 80s, and it didn't work. Either way, it was a move that was, even at that moment, I said, oh, this is cool. This was a trade that felt like two kids trading baseball cards. It wasn't about you take this bad salary or you take these prospects for a superstar. It was a swap of stars. You take our star slugger and our star infielder. You take our star slugger and our star infielder, and let's switch them. And that's exactly what they did. Now, it paid off handsomely for the Blue Jays, as Roberto Alomar, who we all know has, let's just say it, a horrific off the field life that he's lived. I'm not a fan of him as a human being, but was a huge part when he became the ALCS MVP and finally got them over the hump into the World Series for the first time. And of course, Joe Carter is, well, they figured out that he was going to touch them all. He never hit a bigger home run in his life. Now, it's funny, Tony Fernandez bounced around a little bit. It was with San Diego. He wound up going to the Mets, and then ironically went back to the Blue Jays to win that title in 1993. He also won it alongside uh, Rickey Henderson. Fred McGriff continued being a great slugger for San Diego, but eventually they decided to dump his salary, and he wound up being a World Series hero for the Atlanta Braves. Now, the last on this day is not as sexy as superstars like Fred McGriff or Roberto Alomar or Pete Rose or Rickey Henderson changing teams, but it was significant. On this day in 1996, the Players Executive Board approved the collective bargaining agreement, essentially putting the final nail in the coffin of the 1994 players' strike and 1995 owners' lockout, which cost baseball the 1994 World Series. Now, in some ways, the scorched earth of 1994, we know it basically destroyed the Expos and gave the best shot for Don Mattingly and Buck Showalter to win a World Series to go away. But maybe that scorched earth had a good long-term effect because there hasn't been a work stoppage since. We've lost an entire season of hockey. We've had all sorts of labor strife with football and with basketball since then. But baseball, who had labor stoppages in 72, in 81, in 85, in 90, and the mother of all of them in 94 to 95, hasn't had a real loss of game work stoppage, I should say. Yes, there was a lockout in 2022, but the season started. We got a 162 game schedule, and no one's going to remember that lockout. But we've seen that that moment gave baseball peace through 2001, opened up the idea of interleague play, which I liked the way they did interleague play initially, which was it was going to be a few weeks in the middle of the season. You had interleague play. It kind of jump started in those, sorry to scratch my nose there, kind of jump started some of those dog days of summer to, make a little variety in the games there. But most importantly, we saw that baseball's work stoppages were going to end through the end of the 2001 season and give baseball some peace. Now, they had to reach an olive branch out to the fans for the 1997 season to say, please, please, we're not going away. We're going to stick around. And the first big home run race happened in 97, and then came the big one. Remember, in 97, there was a race between Ken Griffey Jr. and Mark McGwire, but they both fell short of Roger Maris. And then in 98, you had the McGwire-Sosa chase, and suddenly the attendance and interest in baseball shot through the roof. Stadiums were being built left and right, and baseball was back. Was it back because of performance-enhancing drugs? Maybe a little bit, but that's a discussion for another day. In 96, the ink dried, and you knew there would be no work stoppages for the next 5 seasons. And that was no small event in baseball. Not quite as glamorous, but very important. And all of these things happened on December 5th, all those different years. Is anything big going to happen this December 5th? Well, time will tell. But maybe the big event was I recorded this podcast. So follow us at Locked On MLB on Twitter or whatever it's called now. And on Instagram, I'm your pal Sully. I'm at Sully Baseball on Blue Sky, Sully Baseball Podcast on Instagram. Remembering the memorable December 5ths of the past, this has been Locked On MLB. I am your host, Paul Francis Sullivan. Please call me Sully.